The silence came without warning. One morning, the caretakers arrived at the primate center, expecting the familiar rhythm, the soft shuffle of movement, the low hum of breath, the deliberate gestures that had once drawn researchers from across the country. Instead, they found Ethan sitting alone near the far wall of his enclosure, his massive frame folded inward, his hands resting motionless in his lap. He did not look up when they entered. He did not respond to his name. He did not lift his hands. For years, Ethan had been known for those hands. They were the reason people came, the reason cameras once lingered a little too long, the reason visitors whispered as if standing in a library instead of a research facility. Ethan had used them to form signs, clear intentional gestures that bridged a gap most believed could never be crossed. He had signed for food, for comfort, for presence. Sometimes he signed simply to be acknowledged. And now those same hands were still. Dr. Michael Harris noticed it immediately. Not because Ethan refused to perform, there had been days before when he chose not to engage, but because this was different. This was not resistance, it was withdrawal. The kind that settles deep and stays quiet, the kind that doesn't ask to be fixed. Michael stood outside the glass for a long moment watching the gorilla, who had once been described as a breakthrough. Ethan's shoulders rose and fell slowly with each breath, steady but heavy as if every inhale required effort. His eyes remained unfocused, fixed on nothing in particular. Something had ended. No announcement had been made, no official conclusion drawn. The change arrived the way loss often does, not as an event, but as an absence that grows too large to ignore. Ethan had not always been like this. There was a time when his enclosure felt alive with intention, when his gaze tracked people as they moved through the room, when his hands lifted almost instinctively, shaping meaning from memory. Researchers used words like remarkable and unprecedented. Caretakers spoke more softly around him, as if volume itself might disrupt the fragile bridge he represented. Back then, Ethan had someone he waited for. Every afternoon at nearly the same hour, he would sit closer to the glass, posture alert but relaxed. When the door opened and footsteps echoed down the hall, his attention sharpened. And when Daniel, his primary caretaker, appeared, Ethan's hands would rise before any prompt was given. Their communication was not perfect. It was not fluent in the way human language is fluent, but it was mutual. It carried intention. Daniel spoke to Ethan as one speaks to someone who understands not to impress, not to test, but to connect. And Ethan responded in kind. Then Daniel was gone. The details were shared quietly, respectfully, as if grief itself required containment. Illness, time, an absence that could not be negotiated away with routine or patience. The staff adjusted schedules. New caretakers stepped in, careful to follow established protocols. But Ethan noticed. He waited for days, then weeks. Each afternoon, he moved closer to the glass, his posture expectant. When Daniel did not appear, Ethan's gestures slowed. His signs became fewer, less precise. Eventually, they stopped altogether. No one panicked at first. Grief, they said, looks different in animals. Give him time. Give him space. Time passed. The space grew larger. Michael reviewed footage from the months that followed. Ethan still ate, still slept, still complied with basic care. But the spark, the sense of presence that had once filled the enclosure was gone. His eyes no longer searched for faces. His hands no longer lifted to shape meaning. Language, it seemed, had lost its reason. What unsettled Michael most was not the silence itself, but how easily the world adjusted to it. Reports were rewritten. Research priorities shifted. Ethan was described as aging now, his earlier communication framed as a phase rather than a capacity. Michael understood the impulse. It was easier to accept loss when it could be explained away. But standing there that morning, watching Ethan sit unmoving in the dim light, Michael felt the weight of something unresolved pressing against his chest. This was not decline. It was not confusion. It was choice. Ethan had stopped speaking because no one was listening in the way that mattered. Michael stepped closer to the glass. He did not call Ethan's name. He did not raise his hand. He simply stood there, present but unassuming, resisting the urge to fill the silence with expectation. Ethan did not turn. The enclosure felt vast, even though nothing about its dimensions had changed. The absence of language had altered the space itself, hollowing it out, leaving behind the echo of what once lived there. Michael thought of all the questions that had driven Ethan's early years. What does it mean when an animal communicates? Where does intelligence end and projection begin? How far should humans go when faced with something that challenges the boundaries they depend on? None of those questions felt adequate now. The only question that mattered was simpler and far more uncomfortable. What happens when meaning disappears? Ethan had not lost his ability to sign. He had lost his reason to. Michael remained there long after the others had moved on, watching as Ethan shifted slightly, adjusting his weight, his fingers curling inward, as if remembering something they no longer reached for. In that small movement, Michael sensed not an ending, but a pause, one heavy with possibility, if only someone was willing to wait without demanding. The voice that had fallen silent had not vanished. It had retreated. And somewhere within that quiet, something was waiting, patient, wounded, and unfinished, ready to respond not to instruction, but to understanding. What no one knew yet was that this silence was not the end of Ethan's story. It was the space where something entirely new was about to begin. Lila arrived without ceremony. There were no headlines, no research notes prepared in advance, no expectations quietly forming behind observation glass. She was small, underweight for her age, her dark eyes too large for her face, in a way that spoke of early loss rather than innocence. The transport crate was carried in gently, as if everyone involved understood that whatever this moment was, it needed softness more than efficiency. She had lost her mother weeks earlier. The details were sparse: an illness, a rapid decline, a young gorilla left clinging to warmth that could no longer answer back. The decision to move her to the facility was made for practical reasons: medical care, safety, stability. No one spoke of what she might bring with her, only of what she needed. And what she needed most of all was presence. Lila did not cry when she was placed in her temporary enclosure. She did not cling to the corners or retreat into herself the way many orphaned animals do. Instead, she sat quietly, her small hands resting on the ground, her head tilted as she took in the unfamiliar world around her. She watched people pass. She watched shadows move. She listened. It was her listening that caught Dr. Michael Harris's attention. Unlike Ethan, who had learned to track human intention with practiced precision, Lila observed without expectation. She did not look for cues. She did not wait to be guided. She simply noticed, storing impressions without assigning them meaning yet. Michael stood back, careful not to intrude. He had learned over years of experience that some connections form best when left undisturbed. It was only later, when Lila was allowed limited visual access to the adjacent enclosure, that something unexpected happened. She saw Ethan. At first she froze, not in fear, but in recognition. Her posture shifted subtly, her shoulders relaxing as her attention focused on the large, still figure across the glass. Ethan sat as he often did now, facing away, his presence heavy with silence. Lila took a step closer. No one prompted her. No one corrected her. She approached the glass slowly, her movements cautious but unafraid. When she reached it, she did not press her face against it or gesture wildly as children often do. She simply sat down, mirroring Ethan's position without knowing she was doing so. Ethan did not turn. For a moment it seemed as though the encounter would end there, two gorillas sharing space without interaction, separated by more than reinforced glass. But Lila did not move away. She remained where she was, her small body, still, her eyes fixed on Ethan's broad back. Then she did something no one expected. She lifted her hand. The gesture was clumsy, unrefined, nothing like the deliberate signs Ethan had once used. It was not a sign at all, really. More an instinctive reach, fingers flexing uncertainly in the air, as if asking a question she did not yet have words for. Ethan shifted. It was slight, so slight that only someone watching closely would have noticed. His shoulders tightened, then eased. His head angled just enough to suggest awareness. Lila froze, her hand still raised, unsure whether she had done something wrong. She lowered it slowly. The room remained quiet. Michael felt his breath catch. This was not training. This was not interaction designed by humans. This was something else entirely, something fragile and unscripted. Lila did not try again immediately. She waited. That waiting mattered. Days passed. Lila was gradually introduced to the rhythms of the facility: feeding times, rest periods, gentle human presence that never lingered too long. She adjusted quickly, her resilience evident in the way she explored her environment without anxiety. But every day at roughly the same time, she returned to the glass. She did not demand Ethan's attention. She offered hers. Sometimes she sat quietly. Sometimes she mimicked his posture, folding herself inward in a way that seemed almost reverent. Other times she experimented, tapping the glass softly, shifting her weight, making small sounds that carried no urgency. Ethan remained mostly still, but not always. There were moments, brief, easily missed, when he angled his body slightly toward her. Moments when his fingers moved, curling and uncurling, as if remembering a language his mind had set aside. He did not sign. He did not gesture with intention, but he noticed. Michael reviewed the footage again and again, struck by the contrast between Lila's openness and Ethan's restraint. Lila had no history of expectation. She did not know Ethan was famous or that his hands had once shaped meaning people argued over. She did not know he was supposed to speak. She only knew that he was there, and that seemed to be enough. What unsettled Michael in the quietest and most profound way was how different this felt from every other attempt to re-engage Ethan. There was no pressure, no disappointment, no subtle hope attached to outcome. Lila was not asking Ethan to return to who he had been. She was meeting him where he was. One afternoon, as rain traced slow patterns down the windows, Lila did something new. She lay down near the glass, curling her body inward, her head resting against the barrier. It was a posture of vulnerability one gorillas often adopt when seeking comfort. Ethan turned his head, fully this time. Their eyes met through the glass, his dark and deep with history, hers wide and unburdened by it. Lila made a soft sound, barely more than a breath. Ethan did not respond vocally, but he did not turn away. Michael felt a quiet ache settle in his chest. Hope, he realized, does not always arrive as excitement. Sometimes it comes as relief, the relief of seeing something fragile survive without being handled too tightly. In Lila, there was no agenda, no desire to extract meaning or prove possibility. She was not trying to revive Ethan's voice. She was simply offering companionship in its most basic form. And in doing so, she was asking a question without words. Not who were you, not what can you do, but are you here with me? Ethan did not answer, not yet. But for the first time since his silence began, he remained facing the question. And that, Michael understood, was the beginning. Because sometimes the most profound changes do not start with teaching or instruction, but with a child who does not know what she's supposed to ask and chooses empathy instead. Lila had not come to give Ethan his language back. She had come to remind him that there was still someone listening, and that reminder, gentle and unassuming, was already changing more than anyone dared to say out loud. No one taught them what happened next. There were no lesson plans, no schedules pinned to a wall, no research assistants taking notes with quiet anticipation. In fact, when the shift began to take shape, most of the staff didn't recognize it at all. It looked too ordinary, too slow, too subtle to matter. But Dr. Michael Harris saw it immediately. It began with timing. Lila no longer approached the glass as soon as she entered the enclosure. She waited. She watched Ethan, first learning the cadence of his stillness, the way his breath rose and fell before he shifted his weight. When she did move, it was not direct. She circled once, then settled her body, angled away from him, rather than toward him. It was a gorilla thing. Michael felt his pulse quicken the first time he noticed it. Ethan responded without lifting his hands. He adjusted his posture, leaning forward slightly, not as a signal, but as an acknowledgement. His eyes followed Lila as she moved, not with the focused intensity he once used to track humans, but with something looser, more intuitive. There was no pressure in it, just awareness. This was not how Ethan had ever learned to communicate before. His early signs had been shaped by repetition and reward by gentle correction and human expectation. What was happening now was different. There was no reward, no audience, no reason to perform. Lila experimented freely. One day she lifted her hand again, not with the hesitant uncertainty of before, but with curiosity. Her fingers bent awkwardly, the movement unrefined and fleeting. She watched Ethan's face closely, not to see if he understood, but to see if he noticed. He did. Ethan did not mirror her. He did not correct her. He did not offer a familiar sign. Instead, his hand moved slowly, hesitant, deliberate, forming a shape Michael recognized instantly, but had not seen in years. It was imperfect, but it was intentional. Michael stood frozen behind the glass, afraid to breathe too loudly. This was not a response to training. It was not prompted by human presence. It was emerging because it made sense here in this moment between these two. Lila stared at Ethan's hand, eyes wide. Then she laughed. It was a sound so small and bright that it startled everyone who heard it. Not a vocalization meant to communicate meaning, but a spontaneous expression of delight. Ethan flinched at the sound, then relaxed his lips, parting slightly in something that might have been surprise. Lila lifted her hand again. This time her fingers shaped something closer to what she had seen. Ethan watched, waited. When she finished, he lowered his hand and nodded once, barely perceptible, but real. The exchange ended there. No one intervened. No one celebrated. That restraint mattered more than anything else. Over the following weeks, these moments multiplied. Not daily, not predictably, but consistently enough to suggest a pattern forming beneath the surface. Lila did not ask Ethan to teach her. She did not repeat gestures until corrected. She tried things, failed, moved on. Ethan responded when he chose to. Sometimes he ignored her completely. Other times he responded with a movement so subtle it bordered on nothing, a shift of fingers, a change in posture, a low sound in his throat that carried no clear definition. And yet Lila understood. Michael struggled to explain what he was witnessing in the language of science. There were no metrics for intention without outcome, no framework for communication that existed purely to affirm presence rather than convey information. What they were building together was not vocabulary, it was trust. Ethan had spent years learning that language came with expectation, that every gesture carried weight beyond its meaning, that what he expressed would be interpreted, analyzed, debated. With Lila, there was none of that. She did not know the significance of his hands. She did not know that people once argued about whether his signs were real. She did not know that entire careers had been shaped around what he could do. She only knew that when he moved his hand, something passed between them, and that was enough. Michael noticed a change in Ethan's demeanor beyond the sessions near the glass. His movements became more fluid, less contained. He vocalized more often, not loudly, not clearly, but without hesitation. He no longer turned away when Lila approached. On one occasion, he repositioned himself closer to the glass without looking toward the observation window first. That to Michael felt monumental. The language developing between them did not resemble the structured signs Ethan once used with humans. It was fragmented, improvised, deeply contextual. A movement meant one thing one day and something else the next. Meaning was negotiated, not fixed. This unsettled some of the staff. They asked Michael what exactly was being communicated, what data they were collecting, whether it was time to standardize the interactions. Michael refused. He understood now that the power of what was happening lay in its resistance to definition. The moment they attempted to formalize it, to extract it from the relationship that sustained it, it would collapse. Language, he realized, does not begin with symbols. It begins with permission. One afternoon, Lila made a gesture that startled everyone watching. It was closer to a sign Ethan had once used with Daniel years earlier, so close that Michael felt his throat tighten. There was no way she could have seen that sign. No footage, no training. Ethan stared at her stunned. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then he lifted his hand. He repeated the gesture. Slower this time, clearer. Lila froze, then copied him again, her version imperfect but earnest. The air in the room felt charged, as if something fragile and ancient had been briefly uncovered. Ethan lowered his hand and turned away, the exchange complete. Lila did not pursue him. She settled where she was content. Michael sat down heavily, his legs suddenly unsteady. This was not mimicry, it was inheritance. Ethan was not teaching Lila signs the way humans teach language. He was passing along fragments of meaning shaped by experience and emotion. What Lila absorbed was not the sign itself, but the understanding that movement could hold intention. That was the difference. As weeks turned into months, the language between them remained private, fluid, and alive. It did not grow quickly. It did not grow neatly, but it grew honestly. Michael understood then that the most profound mistake humans make when observing animal intelligence is assuming that learning must look like teaching. That language must be transferred rather than discovered. What Ethan and Lila were building did not belong to the laboratory. It belonged to them. And in that quiet exchange, unmeasured, unrecorded in any meaningful way, something essential was being restored. Not just Ethan's voice and not just Lila's curiosity, but the idea that language at its core is not about being understood by the world. It is about being understood by someone who chooses to stay. What no one realized yet was that this fragile private language, formed without instruction or expectation, was moving toward a moment that would soon demand attention. One word, one choice, and a meaning that could not be taken back. The moment did not happen when anyone was watching closely. It arrived quietly during an afternoon that looked no different from the dozens that came before it. The light through the windows was softer than usual, filtered by clouds that flattened the world into muted shades of gray. The facility hummed with its familiar background sounds, footsteps in distant halls, the faint rattle of carts. But inside the enclosure wing, everything felt suspended. Lila sat near the glass, her back partially turned, occupied with a piece of straw she had been pulling apart with deliberate focus. Ethan rested several feet away, his posture relaxed but alert, eyes half-lidded, as if he were listening to something beneath the surface of the room. They had been like this for several minutes together, but not interacting. Dr. Michael Harris almost missed it. Lila paused. The straw slipped from her fingers. She lifted her head slowly, not toward the glass, not toward the observation window, but toward Ethan. Her gaze lingered on his hands, not the way she had studied them before, with curiosity or imitation, but with intention. She rose and took 2 small steps closer. Ethan opened his eyes fully. The air between them seemed to tighten, not with tension, but with awareness. Lila raised her hand. The movement was careful, measured, nothing like the impulsive gestures she had tried in earlier weeks. Her fingers formed a shape Michael had never seen her attempt before. It was not precise, but it was unmistakable. Ethan froze. For the first time since Lila's arrival, his reaction was immediate and unguarded. His breath caught audibly, chest rising in a sharp inhale that broke the stillness. His eyes widened, fixed on her hand, as if it held something fragile and impossible. Michael's heart began to race. The gesture Lila had made was not one the staff had ever taught her. It was not part of any training program. It was not a sign meant to identify an object or request a resource. It was a word Ethan had used once years ago in a context no one had ever fully understood. Lila held the shape for only a moment before lowering her hand, uncertainty flickering across her face. She glanced away as if worried she had crossed some invisible boundary. Ethan did not look away. He moved closer to the glass, slowly, deliberately, as if afraid that any sudden motion might shatter what he was seeing. His hand lifted, not automatically, not reflexively, but with the careful gravity of choice. He repeated the gesture. This time it was clearer. Michael felt his throat tighten so suddenly he had to steady himself against the wall. There was no doubt now. This was not coincidence. This was not mimicry. This was recognition. The word Lila had signed was never meant for humans. It did not translate neatly into English. Researchers had once debated its meaning, trying to pin it down to something measurable, together stay us. But those interpretations had always felt incomplete, flattened by the need for clarity. What mattered now was not what the word meant to observers. What mattered was what it meant to Ethan. His hand trembled slightly as he lowered it. His shoulders softened. A low sound escaped him, quiet and unstructured, carrying no specific information, but overflowing with emotion. Lila watched him, eyes wide, absorbing his response without understanding its weight. Michael realized then that this word had never been about communication across species. It had been about connection within one. Ethan had not signed for the cameras. He had not signed for validation. He had not even signed for understanding. He had signed because someone had finally spoken to him in a language that did not demand performance. Lila took another step closer. She did not repeat the sign. She did not reach out again. She simply stood there, present, her small body steady, her expression open. Ethan met her gaze through the glass, his own eyes shining with something that looked dangerously close to relief. The exchange lasted seconds, but its impact rippled outward in ways no one could contain. Michael replayed the footage later that evening, hands shaking as he paused and rewound the moment again and again. The implications were staggering, not scientifically, but ethically. If this word had emerged naturally without instruction, then everything they thought they understood about teaching, learning, and control needed to be reconsidered. Because this was not proof of intelligence, it was proof of relationship. In the days that followed, Ethan did not repeat the word for anyone else. Not for caretakers, not for researchers, not when prompted gently, not even when Daniel's old recordings were played back. The word belonged to Lila, and Ethan guarded it fiercely. Some staff members were unsettled by this. They questioned whether they should intervene, document, replicate. Michael shut those conversations down immediately. He understood something now that years of study had failed to teach him. Meaning cannot be extracted without being destroyed. Lila, for her part, did not treat the moment as extraordinary. She did not change her behavior. She did not seek attention. She continued her quiet routines, her gentle presence near Ethan, her patient observation of the world as it unfolded. But something in her had shifted. She carried the word differently now, not as a tool, not as a trick, but as a shared secret. She did not sign it again for days. When she finally did, it was during a moment of uncertainty when Ethan had retreated inward after a loud disturbance elsewhere in the facility. She signed it once, softly. Ethan responded immediately. Michael watched from the shadows, heart heavy with awe. This was not language evolving. This was trust solidifying. The realization forced Michael to confront an uncomfortable truth. For years, humans had celebrated moments when animals appeared to reach toward human understanding. But here, the most profound moment had occurred when humans were irrelevant. The word that changed everything was never meant to be heard by people. It was meant to be received. Ethan did not need the world to know what he and Lila shared. He needed to know that someone else did. And in that knowledge, something within him settled. The word did not bring him back to who he had been before the silence. It allowed him to move forward as who he was now. For Michael, the lesson was inescapable. Intelligence does not announce itself for approval. Meaning does not exist to be measured. And connection, when it is real, does not ask to be witnessed. The world would eventually learn about this moment. Stories would be told. Interpretations would multiply. But the truth would remain simple and untouchable. An elder gorilla did not teach a baby gorilla to sign so humans could marvel. He shared a word because she had earned it. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching, whether they understood it or not, that the most powerful language in the world is the one we are willing to protect from ourselves. After the word was shared, nothing looked the same, but nothing announced itself as changed. There were no celebrations, no meetings called to mark a breakthrough. The facility continued to run on its careful routines, the days folding into one another as they always had. Yet within that sameness, something essential had shifted. It was not loud, it was not measurable. It lived in posture and timing, in the way Ethan and Lila occupied space together. Ethan grew quieter, not withdrawn, but settled. He no longer lingered near the glass with the expectant stillness that once suggested waiting. He chose where to sit. He rested where light touched the floor, where sounds carried without startling. When caretakers approached, he acknowledged them with calm familiarity, then returned to his own rhythm. The old urgency, the sense that something must be offered, must be shaped for someone else, was gone. Lila noticed this first. She adjusted without hesitation, as children do when they sense safety. She no longer hovered at the glass. She explored, played, tested her balance and strength, occasionally glancing toward Ethan, not for permission, but for orientation. When she returned to him, it was unforced. When she left, he did not follow with his eyes. What Ethan passed on to Lila was not a system of signs. It was a way of being. Dr. Michael Harris understood this with growing clarity as the weeks passed. He watched Lila navigate small conflicts with confidence, using posture and sound, with an instinct that felt both learned and innate. He watched Ethan respond selectively, not as an instructor correcting errors, but as a presence shaping boundaries through consistency. There was teaching here, but not in the way humans understand teaching. Ethan did not repeat gestures to ensure accuracy. He did not insist on replication. When Lila made a movement that missed its mark, he did not correct her. He allowed the moment to pass, trusting that meaning would find its own form when it was ready. And it did. Sometimes through a glance, sometimes through silence, sometimes through the shared stillness That followed a disruption elsewhere in the building, a loud noise, a sudden movement when Lila instinctively drew closer and Ethan angled his body to shield without touching. Michael felt a quiet awe watching this unfold. He had spent his career believing that knowledge was something transferred, something documented and preserved. What he was witnessing now challenged that belief at its core. The most valuable thing Ethan gave Lila could not be written down. It could not be reproduced. It could not be taken without being damaged. Ethan gave Lila permission to exist without performance. That permission changed everything. As Ethan aged, the signs of physical decline were subtle but unmistakable. His movement slowed. He rested more. He no longer engaged for long periods at a time. The staff monitored him closely, prepared to intervene if necessary. But Michael insisted on one thing above all else: Ethan's world would not shrink around his age. He would not be reduced to a case. Lila seemed to understand this intuitively. She adapted her energy to match his settling near him, during long rest periods, occasionally vocalizing, softly, not to elicit a response, but to anchor him in presence. Ethan responded when he chose to. When he did not, Lila remained. There was no anxiety in that waiting. One evening, as dusk softened the enclosure into shadow, Michael stood quietly at the edge of the room. Ethan lay resting, his chest rising and falling with slow assurance. Lila sat nearby, hands folded loosely, her attention split between the sounds of the facility winding down and the steady presence beside her. She lifted her hand once, not to sign the word again, not to call attention, just a small movement, more habit than intention. Ethan did not respond, and Lila lowered her hand without disappointment. Michael felt something settle in his chest. This was the legacy, not a word repeated, not a skill preserved, but a relationship strong enough to survive silence. Ethan had once been celebrated for what he could do. He was now valued for who he allowed himself to be. In giving Lila space to grow without expectation, he ensured that her voice, whatever form it took, would not be shaped by the need to satisfy an audience. That was the gift. When Ethan passed months later, the loss was felt deeply but quietly. There were no press releases, no public statements framing his life as a triumph or a tragedy. The staff mourned him the way one mourns someone who has been truly known privately with respect. Lila was present. She did not search the enclosure for him. She did not vocalize in distress. She sat where he had rested, her posture composed, her breathing steady. She stayed there for a long time, then rose and moved on. Michael understood then that Ethan had prepared her for this too, not by explaining loss, but by modeling continuity. What Ethan passed on was not language meant to be decoded. It was resilience shaped by connection. It was identity rooted in relationship rather than recognition. It was the understanding that meaning does not disappear when words do. As Lila grew, she carried these lessons with her. Her communication evolved fluid and grounded, shaped by experience rather than instruction. She did not repeat Ethan's signs as artifacts. She expressed herself in ways that fit her life, her body, her world. And in doing so, she honored him more completely than any replication ever could. For Michael, the story reshaped everything he thought he knew about intelligence and responsibility. It reminded him that the highest form of teaching is not demonstration, but trust that the most ethical legacy we can leave is not knowledge imposed, but space protected. Ethan did not teach Lila how to speak. He taught her that she did not need to speak to matter. And in that lesson, passed quietly and without witnesses, something far greater than language endured. In the end, this story was never really about a word. It was about what happens when we stop demanding proof and start honoring presence. Ethan did not change the world by speaking, signing, or performing for human understanding. He changed it by choosing restraint, by offering connection without expectation and trust without conditions. In a world that constantly measures worth by output, his quiet legacy reminds us that meaning often lives in what is withheld, not what is displayed. For Lila, the greatest inheritance was not language intelligence or even survival skills. It was safety, the kind of safety that allows growth to happen naturally, the kind that says you are enough before you show me anything. Because of Ethan, she did not learn that love must be earned through performance. She learned that belonging can exist before achievement. And that lesson matters far beyond the walls of one facility. For us as viewers, readers, and humans navigating an increasingly loud world, This story asks uncomfortable questions. How often do we value others only when they produce something for us? How often do we mistake control for care, instruction for connection? And how often do we overlook quiet acts of protection because they don't announce themselves? Ethan's life challenges the assumption that intelligence must be demonstrated to be real. Lila's growth challenges the belief that guidance must be forceful to be effective. Together they show us a different model, one where growth unfolds not through pressure, but through patience. This is especially powerful in a time when many of us feel unseen unless we speak louder, move faster, or prove more. Ethan reminds us that dignity does not require an audience. Lila reminds us that healing does not require explanation. And their bond reminds us that the deepest lessons are often passed on without words. There is also a responsibility embedded in this story. With intelligence comes power. With curiosity comes temptation. Ethan's legacy forces us to confront how easily fascination can turn into exploitation when boundaries are ignored. The most ethical choice Michael made was not to publish, replicate, or extract meaning, but to protect it. In doing so, he honored not just Ethan's intelligence, but his autonomy. That may be the hardest lesson of all, that not everything meaningful is meant to be shared, consumed, or understood by everyone. Some truths exist only between those who earn them, and yet the impact of those truths can still ripple outward, quietly reshaping how we see the world. This story is not asking us to marvel at animals as exceptions. It is asking us to recognize them as beings capable of memory restraint, trust and teaching in ways that challenge our assumptions about intelligence and hierarchy. It invites us to replace domination with respect, curiosity with humility, and control with care. If this story moved you, it's likely because it touched something universal, the desire to be seen without being judged, to be guided without being controlled, and to be remembered not for what we produced, but for how we made others feel safe. That is the power of animal stories like this one. They don't just entertain us, they reflect us back to ourselves, asking who we are when no one is watching and what kind of legacy we leave behind in silence. If you believe stories like this matter, stories that inspire compassion, patience, and a deeper respect for life, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, told with care rather than spectacle, and shared with the intention to heal rather than impress. Together, by choosing to listen more closely, protect what is fragile, and honor bonds that don't need words, we can help create space for more stories that truly matter. Thank you for being here.